Krampus, the Christmas devil who punishes naughty children. Every year in early December, children in Austria get ready for St. Nicholas to visit them. If they've been good, he'll reward them with presents and treats, but if they've been bad, they'll get a lot more than a lump of coal. They'll have to face Krampus. Who's Krampus, you ask? He's the half-man, half-goat who comes around every year to chase naughty children and maybe even drag them to hell. European versions of St. Nicholas have long had scary counterparts like Blishnickel and Neckrubrik, who doled out punishments. Krampus is one such character who comes from folklore in Austria's Alpine region, where he's been frightening children and amusing adults for hundreds of years. Krampus and St. Nick's other bad brothers have their origins in pagan celebrations of the winter solstice. Later, they became part of Christian traditions in which St. Nicholas visited children to reward them on December 5th or 6th. Around that time, his menacing partner would also visit kids to punish them. In Alpine Austria and some parts of Germany, this day was known as Krampusnacht or Krampus Night, when adults might dress as Krampus to frighten children at their homes. Children might have also seen Krampus running through the streets during a Krampuslauf, literally a Krampus run. If Krampusnacht was a way to scare kids into behaving themselves, the Krampuslauf, which isn't tied to a specific day, was a way for grown men to blow off steam while probably still scaring kids. Austrian men would get drunk and run through the streets dressed as the fearsome creature. Like Krampusnacht and Krampuslauf, tradition continues to this day. The introduction of mass visual media couldn't help but sweep the charismatic Krampus up in its wave. When the postcard industry experienced a boom in Germany and Austria in 1890s, it opened the way for Krampuskarten. These holiday cards weren't meant to keep you feeling warm and fuzzy. Ones marked Gross von Krampus, greetings from Krampus, showed Krampus stuffing a distressed child into a satchel or preparing to hit one with his bundle of birch sticks. Many of these postcards depicted Krampus going after children with his sticks, leading them away in chains or carrying them off in his bag. There were also cards that were a little more adult. Krampus cards in the early 20th century showed him punishing children, yes, but also proposing to women. In some cards, Krampus is portrayed as a large woman whipping tiny men with her birch sticks and carrying them off in her satchel. In another, a smiling woman dangles a defeated-looking Krampus in the air, holding his bundle of birch sticks behind her back. You can draw your own conclusion about the gender politics in these days. Over a century, most Americans probably never saw a Krampus card or even knew what a Krampus was. That changed in 2004, when the art director and graphic designer Monte Beauchamp published a book of Krampus cards and helped organize an art show inspired by the cards. Whether or not Beauchamp is primarily responsible for introducing Krampus cards to the U.S., Krampus has become a sort of ironic icon in America. Etsy has a whole section of items inspired by classic Krampus cards, but if you don't have time to send cards, you can buy an ugly Krampus sweater to wear your local Krampus party or Krampuslauf. Krampus' popularity in the U.S. arguably peaked with the 2015 featured film Krampus. Don't be confused with many other low-budget Krampus movies. Beware if you watch them. Although Krampus is relatively new to the U.S., this Alpine legend is the original Bad Santa. Krampus Claus by Julliette. Here's the deal with bad children. Bad kids are both spoiled and have total control of their adoring parents, or they are abused and neglected by their parents, or this is something wrong with their genetic makeup, and they are bound for a life of failure. I spent a career scaring children straight, but I never bagged one up. Not once. A few bad adults maybe, or an abusive parent, but never a child. Although there have been a few children who were truly the spawn of our old friend Satan, so to speak, but not many. In the end, there will be their own worst enemy. Well, at least one of them. The rest of them go into politics. So what shall I do with you, Max? Over the decades, Max have encountered demons, werewolves, fallen angels, goblins, vampire hunters, banshees, and ghosts, and all sorts of unsavory creatures, including warm-blooded humans. But this was the first encounter with Krampus. Max looked hard at the hairy horned man creature with a voice like gravel and too many cigarettes who sat on the closed toilet of his downstairs bathroom. Why are you in my bathroom, Krampus? Because the world is full of shit, so I feel more comfortable here, said St. Nick's demon. Krampus rolled up his long tongue and opened the window across the bathroom. Stop it, said Max. Close the window and put your tongue back in your mouth. What's the matter, vampire man? Afraid I'll leave a coal in your stocking? Or better yet, drag you to hell? I'm afraid you'll never go out of my bathroom, said Max. Krampus stood up and stomped around, stretching his knobby legs. Do vampires pee? Seriously, man, do you ever take a crap like a normal person? Why is your tongue so long? Oh, that. When I was a kid, just a small hairy thing with tiny horns. Kids made fun of me. You know, other demon kids. Some asshole said I was saying shit about him, so he and his friend tried to pull my tongue out, rather than rip out of my head. My tongue stretched and stretched and stretched, but when they were just about to give up, I wrapped my tongue around him and choked them out until they turned to a puddle of green-gray slime. About that time, St. Nick, he wasn't a saint yet, but came strolling by. I could see the light bulb going off in his head. There weren't light bulbs back then, but he had a great idea. He asked me if I wanted to help him with bad kids. And the rest is Christmas history. So what about you? Have you always been a vampire? I was born a vampire. What are you doing here in my house, bugging me? You're a vampire. Look at you, all handsome and healthy looking. You should look dead, said Krampus as he flopped down in a black vintage Ernst chair. Do you have any coffee? Max was about to say something when he looked up and saw his girlfriend, sometimes girlfriend, friends with benefits, Mehetabel, came down the stairs in a fuzzy pink robe. She was also a vampire and so many other things that Max could never explain or even understand. Krampus, she said as she saw the demon sitting in Max's favorite chair. I didn't know you and Max knew each other. We don't, but I was passing through town, you know, and I was overwhelmed with the emotion of this time of year. I didn't want you to be alone. St. Nick doesn't want anything to do with me outside of Christmas and the big birthday party his wife throws for me every year. Everyone else fears me. The other demons are assholes. I need a place to chill and rest my tongue, said Krampus. Poor baby. No one should be alone this time of year, said Mehetabel when she walked to Max and gave him a kiss. I'll make some coffee. Her hand went around and over his butt. Then she slipped into the kitchen. Nice gig you have here, Max. Beautiful home. Beautiful woman. Nothing for me to be mad about. Maybe if I just hang for a few hours. You know, the girls don't like me much. Even with my amazing tongue. Now, Mabel there. She is one fine piece of... Stop right there. Where do you know her from? You and she haven't... No. We've crossed paths a few times in the past. No hanky-panky. Aside from your amazing body, and great head of hair. What the hell is she doing with you? Max turned around without answering and went into the kitchen. Metabelle was sipping on a mug of warm blood with a shake of cinnamon. Hey Max, she said, kissing him lightly on the lips. What should I do with him? Give him some coffee, and he'll go on his way. We've shown charity and compassion. That's all he wants. This is all anyone wants. Krampus came into the kitchen and laughed. You're so sweet. Well, I'm going to leave you two lovebirds alone. Be good to her, Max, or I'll come back for you. And not in a good way. Thanks for letting me chill here for a bit. Then he put his clawed hand into his pocket and pulled out 2 lumps of coal and set them on the table. If you squeeze these tight enough, they'll turn into diamonds. Okay now, enough of this sentimental shit. I have to go kick some bad kid's ass. See you next year. Then he turned and went out to the front door with a slight smell of sulfur and nutmeg. Max and Metabelle looked at each other and smiled. They picked up each other's piece of coal and squeezed as hard as they could. Metabelle opened her hands and found a playing card. It was a queen of diamonds. Max opened his hand and found a baby diamondback rattlesnake. He threw the snake out the window. Right as he did, the hawk flew by and grabbed the snake and flew away. Not the kind of diamonds we expected, said Max. Let's go upstairs. Then he took her hand and led her to his bedroom. Later they made love, and as they watched the setting sun from his bedroom window, Max kissed Metabelle again and reached into the drawer of his nightstand. I have something for you, he said. Then he slipped a diamond ring on her hand. I love you. Marry me. Okay, she said, her eyes tearing up. I love you too. Somewhere in the city, Krampus walked down an alley looking for trouble. He stopped and laughed. Good boy, Max, he said. Good boy, Max. Krampus by J. Speziahttps. Each year on December 5th, a person in my hometown is brutally murdered. The police are at a loss. With each victim, a poetic story is left behind. Below are the stories from the past 3 years. Frederick loved to smile. He was always glad. Happy, warm, and gentle, never, ever sad. But Frederick had a secret he only knew. This man loved to strangle children. He turned them cold and blue. The townsfolk never found out, for he was very smart. Frederick took their corpses and pulled them apart. It couldn't be young Frederick, everyone would say. He is a man of God, and we always see him pray. The cold night came, and Frederick rested his head, but soon he heard a scratching underneath his bed. Frederick trembled as he looked, oil lamp in hand. On his bedroom floor, the demon had a plan. Away with you, beast! The night is dark and long. Ye have no business here, for I have done no wrong. Krampus only laughed as he took his rusty chain. He hung Frederick by the neck until he writhed in pain. The links constricted, digging into skin. Frederick then cried out, praying for his sin. He begged and pleaded until his final breath. With a beautiful snap, Frederick bled to death. Krampus hung him out to dry. All the townsfolk began to cry, but not the children, for now their souls were free, and under Frederick's body their phantoms danced with glee. Greta loved herself more than she could bear. She never had enough and could never ever share. Want was never more, it was only need. Her envy grew, and with it came her greed. Greta needed more, but money wasn't flush, so she stole from her family. It gave her quite the rush. It was not enough. To herself she would say, I must have it all, there is no other way. Into her grandparents' home Greta crept in. They had many treasures, jewelry and gemstones piled. When she looked about, wealth she did not find, only ancient Krampus with something on his mind. Greta shrieked and trembled, staring at his claws. She knew there would be no mercy from this evil Santa Claus. You shall have the riches, Krampus said with a grin, and he gave them to her after peeling off her skin. Herman was a doctor, for that's what he would say, and every single patient that would have to pay, he cut and pulled and burned, and after he was done, for more he always yearned. The surgeon was a butcher who had taste for swine. With the bleeding flesh he paired a fine red wine. The hunger took him, body and mind and soul, yet this evil, it never took its toll. Herman was alone, in his chair he sat. All his human meat had made him very fat. He drifted off to slumber and began to snore, until the angry Krampus bursted through the door. Herman could not move. He wet himself in fright. Krampus licked his lips and let out a squeal of delight. First he gouged out his eyes, and Herman could not see. Then Krampus flayed his tongue. It was tender as it could be. Christmas is joyous, full of love and cheer, but you must remember that we will all fear. So be kind to one another, show love and need this text, or Krampus will find you, and you'll certainly be next. The police are seeking any information that may help bring the killer to justice. As of this morning, 3 more bodies have been found in a neighboring village. The Elf on the Shelf, written by the Vesper's Bell. Growing up, or at least since the mid-2000s, my house always had an elf on the shelf during the Christmas season. If you don't know, elves on the shelf are these little elf dolls that are supposed to be scouts for Santa Claus. I named mine Humble. I think I was trying to name him Humboldt, but got the words confused, though I have long forgotten why I wanted to name him Humboldt in the first place. Anyway, starting every Thanksgiving, my parents would stick somewhere he could practice domestic espionage, and at night he would head back to the North Pole to snitch on me to Santa. He always flew back every dawn, always hiding somewhere new, and each morning was like a little miniature Easter egg hunt to find him. Of course, it was my parents who moved the damn thing every night. I guess I have some mixed feelings about the tradition. On the one hand, it was fun and magical, but on the other, it was pretty aggressive expansion on the practice of using Santa to keep your kids in line. I've always heard people say it normalizes government and corporate surveillance, but in the age of Alexa and Google, that's a bit of a moot point. But I think the weirdest thing about the elf on the shelf is how I was never allowed to touch the doll. I would talk to him, tell him what I wanted Santa to bring me for Christmas, and all that, but touching him might drain him of his magic and keep him from returning to the North Pole where he belonged. Here's the actual line from the storybook that comes with the doll. There's only one rule that you have to follow, so I will come back and be here tomorrow. Please do not touch me. My magic might go, and Santa won't hear all I have seen or know. Obviously, the taboo against touching the elf makes it harder for a kid to conceive that it's actually their parents moving it around, or worse, testing that hypothesis, which to me it feels exceptionally manipulative. That might be because I never touched Humble, even years after I stopped believing in Santa. I have 2 younger siblings, so I guess I could rationalize it as not touching him for their sake. Part of me just could not overcome the taboo, not touching the doll that my mother had instilled in me. I'm 18 now and in college, living in an off-campus apartment. I went home for Thanksgiving, of course, and sure enough, Humble was there on the mantelpiece. My sister Jenna loves the little creature, full-heartedly believing he's magic and works for Santa. I felt a little guilty her buying the storybook hook, line, and sinker, but decided it was none of my business. When I got up Sunday morning, the day I was supposed to head back to my apartment, my mother asked me so covertly as she could if I knew where Humble was. He was missing, and no one in my house seemed to know where he went or would be likely to play such a cruel trick on our youngest member. When he could not be found, my mom took Jenna aside and tried to explain that Humble must have been storm-stayed at Santa's workshop. To everyone's surprise, Jenna was delighted at the news. She said that she told Humble that she worried about me living away from home and asked if he could spend some time at my apartment to make sure I was safe, and that's where he must be. My mother eagerly went along with this since it gave her time to find a replacement doll and told me to call as soon as I got to my apartment to confirm that Humble was safe and sound. Wink, wink. I promised to call the second I got back, and after saying my farewells, I embarked on the hours-long drive back to my apartment. I managed to get back before dawn, which of course comes obscenely early this time of year, and as I awkwardly tried to make my way through the door with all my travel bags at once, I caught a glimpse of something bright red standing outside of the off-white of my kitchenette. It was Humble, sitting atop my Keurig with his legs crossed and his hands in his lap. I knew it was Humble because my mother had put a bell from a Lindette chocolate bunny around his waist like a belt and stuck a miniature candy cane in it. The normally upsetting situation of someone breaking into my apartment was tempered by the fact that it had obviously been a member of my family, but who and why? Instead of calling them like I promised, I took a picture and texted it to my mom with a message, "Did you do this?" Moments later, the following conversation ensued. "Sweetie, why would you steal Humble? You know how much your sister loves him." "Mom, I swear I didn't steal him. I just found him here when I got home. If you didn't do this, check to make sure you still have my spare key, because I know I locked it up before I left." "Okay, I just checked. It's right where it should be. I asked your father, and he doesn't know anything either. He's looking over the security camera footage to make sure we weren't broken into. Sweetie, I swear we didn't do this. Maybe you should come back home or stay in a hotel until we figure this out." At this point, I searched my entire apartment for any sign of forced entry, a hidden intruder, something missing or damaged, and found absolutely nothing. The only thing out of place is Humble, and it makes no goddamn sense. The most likely explanation was that someone in my family was messing with me, but I couldn't think of anyone who would do this to me and Jenna, let alone able to have stolen Humble, drive to my apartment, place it, and then drive back undetected. The only other rational explanation was that I had a very stealthy, very skilled stalker who chose in an oddly specific way to mess with me. Of course, there was an obviously irrational explanation for where Humble came from, but I shut down that line of thought immediately. It was just a damn doll. I really didn't want to drive anymore and decided I couldn't miss class the next day or waste money on a hotel, so I asked my boyfriend to spend the night, who was more than happy to oblige. That still left the issue of what to do with Humble. Obviously, I should have just mailed him back home, but that would require that I moved him. That had to be why they did it. They knew I was still afraid to touch Humble, and they were teasing me. However they did it, that had to be it. That was good though, I thought. My unwillingness to touch Humble was childish, and I was all grown up now. I needed to move past it. The doll was sitting right there on my coffee machine. All I had to do was grab him, put him in a box, and ship him out. My little sister gets her doll back, and I'd become just a little bit more mature. There was no rational reason not to do it. I honestly couldn't tell you how long I just stood there, staring at Humble, trying to muster up the courage to pick him up. It was ridiculous, but I just couldn't do it. My mother had ingrained the taboo into me too damn well, and touching Humble would be like crushing a fairy. "Hey, Humble," I started mumbling. "I know my sister asked you to keep an eye on me, and I know you're just trying to make her happy, but you're supposed to be watching her to report back to Santa, remember? I know you used to watch me, but I'm growing up now. I don't even get presents from Santa anymore. You don't need to watch me, and I'd hate for you to report on Jenna to be inaccurate because you're here and not there. So please, after you report back to the North Pole tonight, go back to Jenna and let her know I'm doing okay." I opened the cupboard and pulled out a pack of blueberry turnovers, placing one beside Humble. "That's for Santa. I know it's probably not his favorite kind of cookie, but it's all I have right now. Merry Christmas, Humble." I don't know why I said those things. I don't know why I gave him the cookie. I didn't actually believe he was one of Santa's elves. At least I didn't think I did. My boyfriend Shane arrived shortly after that. If he noticed Humble, he didn't mention it. He's a pretty typical college-age guy and was so eager to get to our bedroom activities that I was eager for anything to get my mind off of Humble. So we got straight to it. I decided that if I still couldn't find the will to box up Humble in the morning, I'll just ask Sean to do it for me. I woke up the next morning in a considerably better mood, courtesy of the previous night's afterglow. Sean was still asleep beside me, per usual, and then I remembered Humble, and that I would have to move him to make my coffee. I thought about waking Sean up for it, and told myself I was being ridiculous to just do it myself. But when I opened my bedroom door and looked into my kitchenette, Humble was gone, and so was the cookie. My first thought was that Sean must have moved him at some point, but the only time he ever got out of bed was to use a washroom, which was adjacent to the bedroom and didn't attach to the living area. He had proven himself time and time again to be completely incapable of getting out of bed without waking me up, so there was no way he went out there while I was sleeping. Even if he had, he never would have cleaned up the cookie. He might have eaten it, but then he would have gone for more and left the package out. I know I'm not making him sound great here, but he's mostly a drinking bang buddy, and I'm not planning on us being a long-term thing. I immediately started searching for Humble, trying to find where in my tiny apartment he possibly could have gone, when I heard a notification from my phone, specifically the one I had set for text from my sister. A suddenly dread swept over me, a fear of something that should have been impossible somehow becoming the only conceivable explanation. I picked up my phone, swiped it open, and then clicked on the message. I saw a photo of Humble sitting on my sister's bed with the accompanying text. Humble's back. He wants me to tell you that Santa says thanks for the blueberry cookie. Chocolate chip's his favorite, but it was still yummy. I was shocked. After that, I didn't know what to think. How could someone have stolen the doll, brought it here, snuck it out again, and then brought it home without leaving any sort of evidence? And why? I got another text from my mother later, who seemed content to write the whole thing off as me and my sister playing a trick on her as payback for everything she ever made us believe about the doll. I insisted we weren't, but soon gave up. I couldn't blame my mom for thinking that. It's what I would have thought. I wish I had been in her position instead of trying to figure out if I was being stalked, haunted by a possessed doll, or just going insane. I was able to rule out the first option very quickly. I set up my phone to record the living room during the night. Nobody came in the front door, and there wasn't the slightest sound of anyone coming in through the windows, and yet, come morning, there was Humble, cozied up in the camera's blind spot. There was no way anyone could have put him there. I still couldn't move him, though. And I was through talking to him. This time, Sean did ask about the doll, but all I told him was, "It's my sister's, don't touch it," and he shrugged it off. I set up my phone to record Humble that night, but it automatically restarted for updates, and Humble escaped back to my sister's unseen. It's been going on like this for weeks now, Humble going back and forth between me and my sister. I've had Sean over every night, but I couldn't tell him why, though. Just that I was stressed with exams and the holidays, and that I needed the dopamine boost, and that I wanted as much time together as possible before the Christmas break split us up. He didn't complain. I didn't know what I thought he was protecting me from. Humble was just a doll, and he had never shown any signs that he meant me any harm. He was just a scout elf doing his job. It's funny that the phenomenon that was causing me so much terror was delighting my sister, and would have delighted me when I was younger. To Jenna, a toy moving on its own was all part of the holiday magic. To me, it was an omen that the world did not operate the way I thought it did, and forced me to question my very sanity. Yesterday, Friday the 20th, was the last day of classes. Humble was with my sister, and my boyfriend caught an overnight Greyhound to his family, so it was the first night in nearly 3 weeks that I was on my own. My plan was to drive back to my family on Saturday, since I didn't want to drive that far in the dark. This would, of course, mean I'll be left alone with Humble when he returns in the morning. I woke up this morning like I did most Saturdays, and only a vague recollection of the previous night. I reached over to try to nudge my boyfriend to get me some coffee, only to remember he wasn't there. I groaned and forced myself out of bed, stumbled into the living area, and just as I had expected, I'm greeted by Humble. Except for today, he's leaning up against the front table. I couldn't leave the apartment, not without moving him. I was trapped. I completely broke down then, dropping down to my knees and sobbing, demanding to know why he was tormenting me like this. I hadn't done anything other than grow up. That's when I realized it. Since I was crying and screaming at a doll, maybe I wasn't as grown up as I thought. I had thought that taking on 5 figures in student loans, getting shit-faced at least once a week, and settling for a practical boyfriend had all meant I was an adult, but I guess I was wrong. Humble was supposed to get his powers from the love of the children who owned him, and that used to be me. I guess that by never overcoming my reluctance to move him, I never really broke that bond, and he was legitimately split between me and Jenna. That really was it then, wasn't it? All I had to do was shove him aside. I could even ask someone to come over, and when they came in, Humble would just be pushed out of the way, but even that felt wrong somehow. As harrowing as this entire experience has been, there was still some part of me that was enchanted by the magic of it all. A part of me that most people lost a long time ago, and it was a part of that I still wasn't ready to give up. But what about Jenna? My sweet little sister who loves her elf doll and still wanted to share him with me, so that she'll know I'll be safe on my own. I couldn't take away her experiencing actual Christmas magic, could I? I took another photo of Humble and texted it to Jenna, explaining that he had trapped me inside and I couldn't be coming home until tomorrow. She understood completely. She would never dare to move Humble either. Of course, a few minutes later I get a call from my mom, and she is livid. She thought I was just too hungover to come home, ranting about how this was going to throw off the holiday plans, and what an irresponsible drunk I was turning into. Considering that I'm presently coping with the whole incident by dipping into a bottle of cherry schnapps I got an early Christmas present, I couldn't say she's wrong. I'm still in my apartment now. Humble hasn't moved. Of course, I can't force myself to move him. I'm not mad at him. I don't think he's doing this to hurt me. I think he's just honestly believe I'm still one of his kids, and he's doing his job the best he can. Today's been rough, but tomorrow will be better. He'll head back to my sister, I'm sure. Why wouldn't he? That's what he's been doing for the past 3 weeks. He'll be out of my way, and I'll be able to leave and head back home. My mom will have calmed down and just be happy to have me home, and everything will be perfect. Though she'll probably try to talk me into doing dry January with her. All that matters is that with me and my sister under the same roof, Humble will stay put until Christmas Eve, and then this nightmare before Christmas will all be over, at least until next year. Maybe by then I'll be a little bit more grown up. The Advent Calendar by Michael Whitehouse. It was the Christmas of 1965, before the man had landed on the moon, before the wall had fallen, before many things good and bad. For me, it was the last time I knew innocence, before the creeping shadow which engulfed my family, before the madness, before death, before... It was the Advent Calendar, the damn thing which I had to have, each door a promise of Christmas, and each window a misted reminder of the warmth and kindness of the festive season. I was 9 years old, and while the parents in my neighborhood would have had no fears for their children, and the past allowing them to play freely in the icy December streets, those days were just lost like breath on a mirror. If snow had fallen, there would have been no joy, no snowball fights in the darkened evenings, no sleighs sliding carefree down the fields nearby. Children could not be children. Though the young may have felt apprehension in the dark, it was the parents who were the most fearful, terrified of the ultimate loss, a pain they could never extinguish. For the previous 3 Christmases, without fail, the worst had happened. A child had went missing. While I was very young, I remember it all as though it was yesterday. The suburb where we lived had become the most somber of places. Such tragedy could do that, slowly draining away any hope of happiness from a community like blood from an open wound. No Christmas tree, no carol sang could stem the flow. The first disappearance was Tommy Graham. He was 11 years old, and although I had seen him around, I didn't really know him personally. I remember my mother crying about it. Just the thought of something terrible happening to a child distressed her greatly, and the pain that the parents must have been going through was often on her lips. That Christmas, my dad held on to me tighter than he had ever done before, and I could tell that they were affected terribly by the disappearance, just as the rest of the community had been. The following year, another Christmas came, and another child was taken. Her name was Cheryl, and she was only 4 years old, tiny and fragile. Tears were shed, misplaced rage vented towards the police, who were unable to find her, and by New Year it was commonly held view that, like Tommy, the year before, little Cheryl could never be found. I, like many of my friends, had been scared of the vanishing children. It was the first time that I became aware that adults could do harm, even the most vulnerable of us, that children were not always safe, and those bigger and stronger than us could have unspeakable things on their minds. Yes, I had heard the fairy tales and frightening stories of the Pied Piper and the Boogeyman, but what was going on in our suburb was far more gut-wrenching, far more real than any fairy tale. Despite this impact, it was not until the 3rd child disappeared that I was truly heartbroken. His name was Finn, and he was one of my friends, a close one at that. He lived on the same street, playing football in a field by his house and walking to and from school together each day. My dad used to take us to the cinema most Sundays, buying us each a hot dog, and when we got home, Mom would serve us a beautiful Sunday roast. Finn was like part of the family, and I still think about him to this day. Where would he have been now? What would he have done with his life? How diminished have we been not knowing that boy or adult he could have become? No laughs, no tears together, just an empty seat in the cinema, a vacant desk in the classroom. I remember his blue eyes and blonde hair more than anything for some reason, and that and his happy-go-lucky nature. I missed him then, and even now I wish that it were not true. Like the others, Finn had been snatched from his bed as he slept on the most peaceful of nights, Christmas Eve. His parents had tucked him in, hanging his stocking over the fireplace, kissing his forehead, whispering a Merry Christmas as he fell asleep. They woke expecting to hear the excited scampering footsteps of their son rushing down the stairs to see what Santa had brought, what wrapped secret boxes he had left by the tree, and instead were confronted by an empty bed, the loss of their only child, an open window, sucking in the bitter frost of Christmas Day. The parents of all 3 children willed not to let go, could not, nor would they assume the worst. Search parties were organized, flyers were continually posted through letter boxes, posted onto bulletin boards and shop windows across the city. And the hopes was always there that somehow, somewhere, the 3 children would be found, unharmed and ready to come home. That year, on the 28th of December, 1965, all hope was extinguished. An old sewer pipe across town, the crumpled, fragile bodies of Tommy, Cheryl, and dear Finn were found, stuffed unceremoniously into a corroded pipe, and the old sewer rotting in the waters below. The pain was palpable, the families indissoluble, and for all of us who knew any of the victims, it was to be a bleak and shadow-ridden Christmas. 3 days later, the month turned. Eyes moved towards Christmas and the shaking fear that something cruel and callous lived among us all. 3 children in 3 years, now into the 4th. What would happen that Christmas Eve? Which family would be broken? Which child torn from his comfy warm bed, dreaming of Santa, only to be killed and discarded like a piece of fetid waste? My parents were nervous, and who could blame them? I sensed the change in atmosphere around the streets where I usually played, families pulling their children in earlier and earlier before the dark came. At night, on more than one occasion, I heard hammering echoing out from an unseen source, no doubt windows being nailed shut to prevent any more children being snatched as they slept. On the 1st of December, my dad hung our Christmas lights outside along the gutter of our roof. Little beads of glowing color piercing through each cold winter night. He tried to continue on as normal and think of happier times. As always, he asked me to help. "You're my wingman, kiddo," he said from behind his bright red scarf, clambering up a set of wooden ladders to the roof above. He had flown for the Air Force before I was born and still used the lexicon those days in the military, but I didn't mind. It made me feel special. In previous years, I had been too small, too young to be of any real use in decorating the outside of our home. My dad always included me. I think he just liked doing things with me. To have some father-son times, standing at the bottom of the ladders looking up at him, whistling Christmas songs out loud, made me feel a part of the accomplishment, part of the yearly celebrations. That December was different, however. It was the first time I was big enough to go up the ladders with them, to look out at the old streets below and see the occasional blink from a weathered set of lights clinging from a neighbor's fence or home. My mom was terrified. She had visions of us both falling to our death. But my father always seemed sure of himself, not arrogant, just confident, cheerfully reminding us all that things will be okay. Looking back, I think that's what I loved about him the most when I was a kid. The fact that he had it all in hand and did everything to reassure his family and friends. I really never felt danger up those ladders. Always loved, always safe, always. Before we came down, I remember looking out to the rooftop, poking out in regimental lines from the streets around. I noticed that the world seemed different from up there, and there appeared to be fewer Christmas lights than ever before. That night, I knew what was coming. My mother tucked me into bed as my dad finished hanging some paper ring decorations from my bedroom ceiling. I always felt that those decorations protected me somehow. I stirred in the night, scared of the dark, and yet at Christmas time I believed that somehow those pieces of colored paper, that blinking Christmas tree in the other room, and those symbols, those pieces of goodwill, would keep whatever monstrosities hid in the dark at bay. My mom kissed me on the forehead and left the room, and there was my dad standing in the corner with his hands behind his back, smiling. "Well, wingman, you know what time it is," he said as we both began to chuckle. "Let me see, Dad, please," I yelled, excited. From behind his back he produced an advent calendar. I leapt for joy across the room and hugged him before snatching it up from his hands and diving back under the covers. Sitting down on the bed, Dad ruffled my hair with his finger, watching me curiously. He knew I loved giving an advent calendar each Christmas, and I had worried that I wouldn't get one that year, as he told me that most of the shops were sold out of them. But Dad, being Dad, had spent hours driving around until he found one, and made sure that on that night of December the 1st, the first night of Advent, there it was. The calendar was beautiful, handmade with crafted drawings on its front and back. The lines and sketched colors lovingly showed a Christmas tree full of lights, the houses covered in snow and the windows beaming with a warm yellow glow, waiting for the night Santa would arrive. What I loved about each year's Advent calendar, the good ones at least, was that they told a story. They showed something wonderful happening. Each door or window would open night upon night, revealing a picture, building until the magical climax of Christmas. I loved the anticipation of the holidays, and the Advent calendar symbolized the hopes that Christmas held. Not just presents, although as a child that was a big part of it, but spending time with my family, seeing my grandparents who usually lived in another part of the country, and getting to eat all the chocolates and turkey I could cram into my mouth. Getting to be away from the boredom of school, getting to play with new toys, getting to have fun with my friends. It was the thought of friends which brought me down for a moment. There I was holding an advent calendar, each cardboard door numbered 1 through 24, from the 1st of December until Christmas Eve. That same night, that 1 year previous, my dear friend Finn had been taken away, murdered, and left to rot down in a sewer. I began to cry, and almost instinctively my dad seemed to know what was upsetting me. He asked me about Finn. When he mentioned his name, I sobbed deeper than I had since his death. Poor friend who would never again go on those carefree days or walk alongside me to school laughing and playing. It was then that my father explained to me something about death, words which have always stayed with me. You know something, kiddo? As long as you keep the memory of the people you've lost in your mind and in your heart, they'll always be alive. They'll always be with you. So Finn is right here, he said, pointing to his chest gently. With those words, I felt a soothing comfort wash over me, and it all cried out. My dad tucked me into bed, kissed me on the head, and said good night, knowing to leave my bedroom door open slightly to let some light from the hall keep my room from the dark. He left the advent calendar sitting nearby, its closed windows facing me from my nightstand, and yet I was exhausted, so my thoughts drifted away from what lay behind those cardboard doors to sleep, and hopefully to a more rested state of mind, but that did not occur. I woke in the night from the horrendous dream about my friend Finn, little 4-year-old Cheryl, and 11-year-old Tommy Graham, crushed down a sewer pipe, the water running over their bodies into mouths which once spoke and laughed and smiled, only then to be rendered silent by an unseen brutal hand. In the darkness, Finn's voice cried out, garbled and drowned. A word came forth and clung to me like no other. Run. I leapt from my bed, soaked in sweat, ready to cry out for my mom and dad, and then something strange caught my attention, shaking me to my core. I looked at the advent calendar, to the drawings of the cozy houses covered in snow, their windows beamed, and to the cold December night, sitting there waiting, almost as I had left them. Yet something was amiss, something which I had no memory of. The first advent door had been opened. The cardboard left ajar like the one in my room. Stepping forward, the sweat dripped from my hand as I pulled back the door to reveal the secrets the calendar had in store for me. And what little light there was, I squinted, my mind slowly piecing together the picture behind door number 1. As my eyes adjusted, I recoiled in horror at the sight and screamed for my family. Within seconds the light was on and my dad appeared, picking me up, consoling me as he put me back into bed. I pointed feverishly to the calendar, telling him that something awful behind the door. Of course he looked and smiled reassuringly. It's just a happy Christmas scene, kiddo, he said, handing it to me. Looking closely, I could see the picture had changed slightly. It depicted an old stone bridge covered in snow, children playing on top of it happily. Yes, it appeared quite harmless, quite serene. My father left, and soon I was drifting back to sleep. Yet my mind hazed over with two thoughts of Finn screaming "run" in my dream, and of what I could have sworn I'd seen in the first little calendar door. The bridge was there, but underneath in the dark, eyes looked out at the children playing gleefully above, eyes which seemed racked with rage and hate. The next day at school went quickly, but on my way home I dragged my feet over the bitter, frozen concrete paths and pavement, thinking of Finn and how he would always walk with me. As my house came to view, I smiled for a moment at the lights Dad and I hung on the roof. They warmed my spirits when I entered my room, but when I entered my room, my soul was chilled, stagnant once more. The next advent door was open. This time I knew I didn't want there to be such a thing in my sleep, as I assumed it must have happened the night before. No, someone had opened it. I touched the yellow door number 2 of the cardboard door, a number which should have promised a treat or a happy picture reminding me that Christmas was near. I hesitated and looked behind it. Another street scene played out before me. This time a small boy pulled a red sleigh behind him as other children threw snowballs at each other, grinning wildly and happy. At first I sighed with relief that the picture had no hidden intruder, no eyes staring out of the darkness in contempt. The calendar back down onto my nightstand. I saw it. The faint outline of a person looking out towards me, almost invisible, yet hiding within that Christmas scene in plain view, sitting there on the boy's red sleigh. I closed my eyes and rubbed them, fearful that they might reaffirm the figure's presence once more when opened. But just as the darkened eyes had disappeared from under the bridge on the 1st of December, the faint outline of an unseen predator had moved on from the picture. I knew that no one would believe me, and even worse, I barely believed it myself. My 9-year-old mind could not comprehend such strange and ominous occurrences, yet I was not so removed from the idea of horrid things scuttering around in the dark, creatures which even parents could not protect you from. The figure had moved on, as I was certain of it. I knew that it must have traveled and hid behind the door of the 3rd of December. The next morning I told myself that I could not open any of the closed doors from the advent calendar. I promised myself, yet something was doing it for me. That night I awoke in the darkness once more. The same dream playing out, poor Finn muffled and drowned by the putrid sewage water, crying out in the dark, crying out, and yet warning, pleading, run. He said, run again. I leapt from my bed, and once more the calendar door from that day had been opened by an unseen force. There in the dark I looked, compelled by the fear of not looking, the terror of not knowing what was to come. For the third picture it became clear to me. Something was on its way. Something unspeakable was plotting, and slowly but surely drawing closer. Behind that door lay another Christmas scene. Families skating on a beautiful ice lake, and under the transparent barrier between the cold air and the icy water there was a shape, darkened, indefinite, but malevolent. A blurred form under the ice, eyes staring up in disgust at the families who happily skated above. I screamed again, and yet the results were all too familiar. My mom and dad arrived tired, yet never annoyed at their child for waking them in the night. Mom put me into bed, and as she did so, I explained frantically to them both that something was appearing in the advent calendar, that each door held proof of something which meant to do me harm. Yet there was no evidence of it, only 3 open doors showing happiness and fun at Christmas. Dad said I was having bad dreams, that he and Mom would sit with me for a while until I fell asleep. I heard them whispering about working in the morning, but they were more concerned about me than losing a few hours of rest. The next day again I tried to ignore the advent calendar, tried desperately to avoid its doors, and again I failed. In the night I awoke from the same hideous dream, and yet this time the door was not open. The door with a yellow number 4 remained closed. I hoped that whatever strange thing was in the pictures had left, that I could forget the hateful haunting eyes, and that I could return to simply enjoying the anticipation of Christmas. But just as I nodded back to sleep, happier than I had been since they had first found Finn's body, I heard something. The sounds of a thumb or finger pulling at the cardboard. I opened my eyes and stared in utter disbelief as the 4th door was pulled open by an invisible hand in the dark. It was strange that I did not scream, but since then I had heard people say that when you are as scared as you can possibly be, you cannot move, nor can you cry out for help. I opened my mouth and no noise came out, a paralysis of fear which was not overpowering. There I laid in the night, staring wide-eyed at the 4th door, wondering what disturbing depiction it would reveal, and even more so terrified of whatever had opened it still lurked nearby. I wish I could say that it stopped, but the horrid revelation ceased, but I cannot. Some nights the dreams of Finn yelling at me to run came, but on other nights they did not. The only consistent was that at some point a calendar door would be open, whether in the morning or at night. Each door would show a happy scene, and each time something hideous, which only I could see, would be momentarily present. One door showed a group of carolers cheerfully singing at night, warmed by a glow of an open window. At the rear there stood an outline, something watching, something waiting, something moving on relentlessly to Christmas Eve, the last door. Another picture showed a small girl, no older than poor Cheryl, who had been killed, placing presents into a stocking. And yet for a moment There was the faintest impression of a hand reaching out from the stocking towards the girl. By the 20th, the horrific pictures had intensified, as too had the dreams. Finn now screaming my name, his voice echoing through the drain, pleading with me to get away. But as those nightly terrors revealed themselves, the pictures had taken on more weight, more immediacy, for I was certain that they now showed the street where I lived. My dad found me crying that night. When asked what was wrong, I told him I believed that there was something evil coming, something horrendous, which had snatched a child each of the previous 3 Christmas Eves. The same evil which had taken my friend, the hidden horror which on Christmas Eve would come for me. Dad reassured me that this was not the case, that I was imagining things. When he looked at the pictures on the calendar, he saw nondescript streets, anonymous faces, nothing which suggested the place where we lived. But I saw differently. The drawings clearly showed house by house, inch by inch, that something was drawing nearer each day, fleeting glimpses of a faint figure, waiting to gorge itself once more. My dad offered to throw the advent calendar away if it was upsetting me so much, but I pleaded with him not to. I needed to know. I had to see what was coming, what was on its way to snatch me from my family, as it had done the other children. The 21st, the 22nd, and 23rd December were torturous. While I should have been excited for Christmas Day, I was not. I was terrified. Terrified, for I knew that I would not live to see it. The calendar door was on the 21st, opened by something unseen while I slept, showed a house come into view, one with glowing lights hung near the roof gutter, and the faint outline of something terrible approaching nearby. I was certain that the house was mine, and that the light which beamed outward from the snowy landscape was for my family, though as I peered out into the night from my window, there was no snow in reality, just a biting wind and a frost which covered everything it shrouded. I could not see a figure out there, but I felt it somewhere close, just waiting for Christmas Eve. On the 22nd, the figure drew closer to our home as the snow fell around it. The advent calendar on the 23rd, the prowler had reached the gate of our garden. That night I had such a terrible vision. In my dream I found myself laying in the dark. I could not see, and all that surrounded me was the empty coldness of winter. Pain coursed through my body, and the sound of running water pushed over it forced me deeper into an abandoned drain. Putting out my hands instinctively, my fingers touched the frozen mouth of another child. Slowly it moved against my hand, and its stagnant lips whispered as if weakened, "Run! Get away!" I did not wake screaming, nor did I leap from my bed, as I had the other nights like an animal fleeing from a predator. There I laid in the silence of the night, and the stillness I cried. The paper chains and decorations my family had hung from my room ceiling proved no protection from the pain or from the thoughts of 3 children, how they had been taken away and how I would be next. And then the day came. Christmas Eve. I was frightened, but a distance took me, one which showed my words and left me dispassionate about the festive seasons, about my family. I wish I had not been that way, and had savored every moment I had left, but I was drained, numbed by the lurking fear which had haunted me for years, tired of it all, a strain which no 9-year-old should have had to bear. My dad knew that I wasn't my usual self, as I normally relished Christmas Eve like most children, excited and completely enthused for what would come, but there I was outside in the cold, helping him fix part of the lights which had unhooked in the wind. I watched my dad on the ladders once more, in the wind rattling everything around, the slats on the roof, the trees, the gutter. I thought about how Finn's family, or little Cheryl's, or even Tommy Graham's had been preparing for Christmas Day like we were, happily unaware of the loss they were about to undergo. At least I knew. I had foresight. Each hideous picture hinting at that faint figure came closer and closer to my home, to open my door as I slept, waiting for Christmas morning, to snatch me from my bed, to slaughter me, discarding my body down a sewer pipe used and forgotten. As the wind howled and the lights clinked and jingled together, I looked back at the gate to our garden, and there I had last seen my future attacker. I could see nothing, just an empty street on the quietest night of the year, but in that absence I could feel eyes bearing into me. My dad climbed down the ladder, whistling merrily to himself. As I looked up at him, I simply asked matter-of-factly if he would nail my window shut. He didn't ask why. He knew many parents had done the same. So we went inside as the evening rolled in, carried by the promise of frost from the outskirts of the city. Dad got his toolbox out and drove a large series of nails into the frame of the window. Once I was confident that there was no other way to open it, I thanked him and asked if he would do one more thing for me. Only one. To sit next to my bed all night and look over me until morning. Unlike the other nights, he did not tell me that there was no monstrosity out there, nor did he say that the world was a safe place, for that would have been a lie. He placed his hand gently on my shoulder and said, "If you need me, I'll sit right here until it's time to open the present." And sat there he did. My mother came in to kiss me on the head before returning back to the kitchen, where she was preparing things for the dinner next day, and I so wanted to see it. Presents meant nothing to me that night. All I cared about was being there at the family table, laughing with Gramps and Graham, and knowing that the nightmare of December 1965 was over. I fell asleep as my dad sat by the bed, reading his book. It must have been 2 or 3 in the morning when I woke. I was unsure of the precise time, but what I knew was that my dad was standing at my window, looking down out to the street below, and whispered to him, asked what was wrong, but his reply was, "Nothing, kiddo. Go back to sleep." Then I heard it, certain and labored. The sounds of footsteps slowly walking up our garden path outside, shambling forward towards our home. The sounds frightened me, and my thoughts immediately turned to the advent calendar, to the faint outline figure which had haunted me. From what little light there was, I could see that the door for Christmas Eve was sealed shut, yet to be opened. The footsteps continued, one after another, slowly and steadily. My dad stared intently outside as I asked if he could see anything there, but he just shook his head in disbelief. The footsteps ceased and silence covered everything, like the frost outside. Suddenly it was broken by 3 loud, booming knocks. It was at our door. I cried out in terror and started sobbing. "It comes to take me, Dad, like Finn and the others," I howled in utter despair as tears slid down my cheek. "Nonsense. It must be the neighbor or something," my dad said unconvincingly. "No, Dad, it's here to take me away," I screamed as I handed the calendar to him. "Open the last door. Open it and you'll see. Christmas Eve. Every Christmas Eve it takes a child, and if you open that, you'll see it. I promise you'll see it." 3 more knocks echoed, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker across my dad's face, so I could hear my mom stirring in her room, shouting through, asking what was going on. 3 knocks. Once more, this time more pronounced. "Please, Dad, look at the door. Open it. You'll believe me. It's here. It's here for me." My dad's hand trembled as he held the calendar slightly. Slowly, he opened the last door to see what was shown. "God, no," he yelled out, and what he heard, the most hideous of sounds, which was laced with dread, a click of a lock, the turning of a handle, the front door opened to the cold, then footsteps climbing stairs, looking, seeking, then slowly coming down the hall towards my room. "Dad, please help me," I pleaded as the nightmarish thing in our room drew closer. He looked at me, trying his best to hide his fear, but I could see it etched in his face, into his soul. "Listen to me, son. As soon as I go out there, I need you to grab all your things, everything heavy, and barricade your door. Don't let anything in this room unless it's me or your mother." I believed in that moment he saw the utter despair in my eyes. As the footsteps reached the room next to mine, he spoke gently, patting me on the head. "It will be okay," he said. Then he was gone. I did as he said. As soon as he left the room, I moved my nightstand, my chair, my books, everything I could against the door, sobbing my eyes out, praying that my parents were safe. At first I heard nothing throughout our house. Then suddenly violent shouting erupted. A struggle quickly followed. Then what sounded like furniture being thrown and glass smashed. And then the worst of it, my mother screamed. She cried and yelled and agonized. And finally I could not bear it anymore. I could not leave her alone. Clearing the things away from my door, I opened it and wandered down the darkened hall. The cold, icy air blew through the house. The front door laid open. Decorations swung in the frozen breeze, and outside knelt my mother alone, terrified, screaming into the night. Losing a parent is hard for a child, and to do so on Christmas Eve, harder still, yet the torture of the night cuts deeper than most. Few can know my true pain. Over the years I tried to understand it more clearly, understand what my life was before and what it is now, to little avail. I cannot give solid explanations, nor can I say that my anger will ever truly diminish. I've tried to live as best as I can, putting the mystery out of my mind each year that is, until Christmas, when the memories flood back like a comforting blanket, soon torn away by a silent hand from the dark. My own children, now grown up, have asked me why I become a little distant at this time of year, and to that I have given no real answer. All I can say is this: I know two things, both which haunt me to this day. The first is that no one ever saw or heard from my dad again. My mother remained tight-lipped until she died about what had come into the house that night, what took her husband, and who can blame her. I also know what the last story of the Advent calendar contained, and what had frightened my dad so badly. It was drawn like the others, a happy Christmas scene, with one horrid addition. It showed a boy sleeping soundly in his bed on Christmas Eve, a boy who looked uncannily like my poor friend Finn, unaware that his life would soon be over, that he was being watched through the frosted window by his killer, whose face looked remarkably like that of my father's. Epia totorum longus hic turba furioris, sanguineus inocia non satidia alut, so spit nunac vitroia recto nunac fiorinus antro moris ube der fut vita saluscia pit quattro, composed for the gates of a marker to be erected upon the site of the Jacobean Club House at Paris. The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. I was sick unto death with a long agony, when they at length unbound me and I was permitted to sit. I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dreaded sentence of death, was the last distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitional voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association and fancy with the burr of the mill wheel, this one for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how horrible an exaggeration. I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin even to grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt for human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from their lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly elocution. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw, too, very a few moments of delirious horror. The soft and nearly imperceptible wave of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls of the apartment. And then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first they wore the aspect of charity, and seemed white and slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame. I saw that from them there would be no help. And then there stole in my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came to length properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished, as if magically. From before me the tall flames sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly. The blackness of darkness supervened. All sensations appeared swallowed up in a mad rush, descent as of the soul into Hades, then silence and stillness, night or the universe. I swooned, but still will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained I will not attempt to define, or even to describe, yet all was lost, and the deepest slumber, no delirium, no in swoon, no in death, no even in the grave, all is not lost, else there is no mortality for man. Arising from the most profaned of slumbers, we break the gossamer web of some dream, and yet in a second afterward, so frail may the web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed. And the return of life from the swoon, there are two stages. First, that of the sense of mental or spiritual. Second, and the sense of physical existence. It seemed probable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we could recall the impression of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not at will recalled it, yet after a long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has never swooned is not he who finds strange palaces, wildly familiar faces and coals that glow, is not he who beholds floating in mid-air the sad visions that many may not view, is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower, is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention. Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul had lapsed, there have been moments when I have dreamed of success. There have been brief, very brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which the lucid reason of a later epoch assures me couldn't have reference only to the condition of seeming unconsciousness. The shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea, interminableness of the descent. They tell also of a vague horror to my heart, an account of the heart's unnatural stillness. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness throughout all things, as if those who bore me a ghastly train had outrun, in their descent, the limits of the limitless, and paused from the weariness of their toll. After this I call to mind flatness and dampness, the madness of memory which busses itself among forbidden things. Very suddenly there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating, the pause in which all is bleak, and then again sound and motion and touch, a tingling sensation pervading my frame, then the mere consciousness of existence without thought, a condition which lasted long, then very suddenly thought and shudder terror, and the earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state, then a strong desire to lapse into insensibility, then a rushing revival of soul and success effort to move, and now a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the sable draperies, of the sentence, of the sickness, of the swoon, the entire forgetfulness of all that followed, of all that a day later, and much earnestness of endeavor have enabled me vaguely to recall. So far I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back, unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There I suffered to remember for many minutes, while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts, they were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled to breathe. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made effort to exercise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitional proceedings and attempt from that point to deduct my real condition. The sentence had passed, and it appeared to me that a very long interval of time had been elapsed, yet not a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a suspicion, notwithstanding that we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and what state was I? The condemned to death, I knew, perished usually at the autos de fe, and one of those had been held on the very night of the day of my trial. Had I been remanded to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months? This I at once saw could not be. Victims had been in immediate demand. Moreover, my dungeon, as well as all the condemned cells of Toledo, had stone floors, and light was not altogether excluded. A fearful idea now suddenly drove the blood of torrents upon my heart, and for a brief period I once more relapsed into insatiability. Upon recovering, I at once started to my feet, tumbling convulsively in every fiber. I thrusted my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step, lest I should be impeded by the walls of a tomb. Perspiration bursted from every pore and stood in cold big beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. I breathed more freely. It seemed evident that mine was not, at least, the most hideous of fates. And now, as I still continued to step cautiously onward, upon my recollection, a thousand vague rumors of the horrors of Toledo, of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated, fables I had always deemed them, and yet very strange and too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper. Was I left to perish of starvation into the subterranean world of darkness, or what fate, perhaps, even more fearful awaited me? That the result would be death, and death of more than customary bitterness. I knew too well the character of my judges to doubt. The mode and hour were all that occupied or distracted me. My outstretched hands at length encountered some solid obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly of stone masonry, very smooth, slimy, and cold. With all the careful distrust with which certain antique narratives had inspired me, this process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of the dungeon, so I might make its circuit and return to the point whence I set out, without being aware of the facts. So perfect uniform seemed the walls. I therefore sought the knife which had been in my pocket when led into the inquisitional chamber, but it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I had thought of forcing the blade in some minute crevice of the masonry, so as to identify my point of departure. The difficulty, nonetheless, was but trivial, although in the disorder of my fancy, it seemed at first insuperable. I tore a part of the hem of the robe and placed the fragments at full length and at right angles to the wall, and groping my way around the prison, I could not fail to encounter this rag upon completing the circuit. So at least I thought, but I had not counted upon the extent of the dungeon, or upon my own weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward with some time, when I stumbled and fell. My excessive fatigue induced me to remain prostrate, and sleep soon overtook me as I lay. Upon awakening and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher of water. I was too exhausted to reflect upon the circumstance, but ate and drank with avidity. Shortly afterwards, I resumed my tour around the prison. and with much toil came at last upon the fragments of the surge. Up to the period when I fell I had counted 52 paces, and upon resuming my walk I had counted 48 more. When I arrived at the rag, there were in all then 100 paces, and omitting 2 paces at the yard, I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circuit. I had met, however, with many angles in the wall, and thus I could form no guess at the shape of the vault, or vault I could not help supposing it to be. I had little object, certainly no hope these researches, but a vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. At first I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor, although seemingly of solid materials, treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage, and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. I had advanced some 10 or 20 paces in this manner, when the remnant of the torn hem of my robe became entangled upon my legs. I stepped on it, and I fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend somewhat startling circumstances, which yet in a few seconds afterwards, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. It was this: my chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and upper portion of my head, although seemingly at less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and the peculiar smell of decay fungus arose to my nostril. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of exerting at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment there came a sound resembling the quick opening and as rapid closing of a door overhead, while a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom, and as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom which had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world has seen me no more, and the death just avoided was of that very character which I regarded as fabulous and frivolous, and the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victims of its tyranny there was the choice of death with its direst physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral horrors. I had been reserved for the latter. By long suffering my nerves had been unstrung until I trembled to the sound of my own voice, and had become in every aspect a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. Shaking with every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than to risk the terrors of the well, of which my imagination now pictured many and various positions about the dungeon, and other conditions that I might have the courage to end my misery at once by a plunge into one of these abysses. But now I was one of the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read of these pits, and that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of their most horrible plan. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many hours, but at length I again slumbered. Upon arousing, I found by my side, as before, a loaf and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel at a draught. It must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course, I know not, but when once again I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild sulphurous luster, the origin of which I could not at first determine, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of the prison. In its size I had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. For some minutes this fact consumed me, a world of troubled vain indeed, for what could be the least importance under the terrible circumstances which environed me than the mere dimensions of my dungeon? But my soul took a wild interest in trifles, I busied myself in endeavors to account for the error I had condemned in my measure. The truth at length flashed upon me. At my first attempt at exploration, I had counted 52 paces. Up to the period which I fell, I must have been within a pace or two of the fragment of the surge. In fact, I had nearly performed the circuit of the vault. I then slept, and upon awakening, I must have returned upon my steps. Thus, supposing the circuit nearly doubled what it actually was, my confusion of mind prevented me from observing that I began my tour with the wall to the left and ended it with a wall to the right. I had been deceived, too, in respect to the shape of the enclosure. In feeling my way, I found many angles, and thus deducted an idea of great irregularity. So potent is the effect of total darkness upon one arousing from lethargy or sleep. The angles were simply those of a few slight depressions or niches at odd intervals. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed to be that of iron or some other metal, and huge plates, whose sutures or joints occasioned the depression. The entire surface of this metallic enclosure was really dubbed in all the hideous and repulsive devices to which the charnel superstition of the monks has given rise. The figures of fiends and aspects of menace with skeleton forms and other more really fearful images overspread and disfigured the walls. I observed that the outlines of these monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, but the colors seemed faded and blurred, as if from the efforts of a damp atmosphere. I now noticed the floor, too, which was of stone, and the centurion, the circular pit from whose jaws I had escaped, but it was the only one in the dungeon. All this I saw indistinctly and by much effort, for my personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back and at full length on a species of low framework of wood, a long strap resembling a surgingle. It passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head and my arm, to such extent that I could, by dint of much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. I saw to my horror that the pitcher had been removed. I saw to my horror I was consumed with intolerable thirst. The thirst it appeared to be the design of my persecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat pungently seasoned. Looking upward, I surveyed the cellar of my prison. The ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, and constructed much as the side walls. In one of its panels, a very singular figure riveted my whole attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented, save that in lieu of a scythe. He held what, at casual glance, I suppose to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively, while I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately over my head. I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterwards the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief and of course slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Wearied at length of observing its dull movement, I turned my eyes upon the other objects in the cell. A slight noise attracted my notice, and looking to the floor I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the wall, which just lay within view of my right. Even then, while I gazed, they came up in troops, hurriedly with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat. From this it required much effort and attention to scare them away. It could have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, for I could take but imperfect note of time, before I again cast my eyes upwards. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent by nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater, but what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had perceptibly descended. I now observed with what horror it is needless to say that its nether extremity was formed by a crescent of glittering steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn, the horns upwards, and the under edge eventually as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid, broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole hissed as it swung through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me by monkish ingenuity. My cognizance of the pits became known to the inquisitional agents, the pit whose horrors had been destined for so bold a recluse as myself. The pit, typically of hell, regarded my rumor as the ultima thule of all their punishment. The plunge into this pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents. I knew that surprise or entrapment into torment formed an important portion of all the grotesquerie of these dungeon deaths. Having failed to fall in, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus there being no alternatives, a different and a milder destruction awaited me. Milder, I have smiled in my agony as I thought of such application of such a term. What boots it to tell of the long, long hours of horror more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing vibrations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, with a descent only appreciable to intervals that seemed ages down, and so down it came. Days passed. It might have been that many days passed ere it swept so close over me to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed, I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedy descent. I grew frantically mad. I struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar, and then I fell suddenly calm and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. There was another interval of utter sensibility. It was brief, for upon again lapsing into life there had been no perceptible descent in the pendulum, but it might have gone long, for I knew there were demons who took note of my swoon, and who would have arrested the vibrations at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt very, inexpressible sick and weak, as if through long inanition. Even amid the agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. With painful effort I stretched my arm as far as my bounds permitted, and took possession of a small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As a portion of it within my lips, there rushed to my mind a half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet what business had I with hope? It was, as I say, a half-formed thought. Man has many such which are never completed. I felt that it was of joy, of hope. I felt also that it had perished in its formation. In vain I struggled to perfect, to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary powers of mind. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angles at my length. I saw the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray the serge of my robe. It would return and repeat its operation again and again. Notwithstanding terrifically wide sweep, some 30 feet or more, and the hissing verge of its descent, sufficient to sunder those very walls of iron, still the fraying of my robe would be all that for several minutes it would accomplish. At this thought I paused. I dared not go further than this reflection. I dwelt upon it with the pertinacity of attention, as if in so dwelling I could arrest here with the descent of the steel. I forced myself to ponder upon the sound of the crescent as it should pass across the garment, upon the peculiar thrilling sensation which the friction of cloth produces on the nerves. I pondered upon all this frivolity until my teeth were on edge. Down, steadily it crept. I took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity, to the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek of a damned spirit, to my heart with the stealthy pace of the tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as the one or the other idea grew predominantly. Down, certainly relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. It was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach the latter from the platter beside me to my mouth, and with great effort, but no further. Could I have broken the fastening above the elbow, I would have seized and attempted to arrest the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down, still unceasing, still inevitably down. I grasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrank convulsively at its sweep. My eyes followed its outward and upward swirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. They closed themselves spasmically to the descent, although death would have been a relief. Oh, how unspeakable! Still I quivered in every nerve to know how slightly a sinking of the machinery precipitated that keen, glistening axe upon my bosom. It was hope that prompted the nerve to quiver, the frame to shriek. It was hope, the hope that trumpets on the rack, that whispers of death get dimmed even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I saw that some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and with its observation there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought, it now occurred to me that the bandage or circingle which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cord. First stroke of the razor-like crescent offward, any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my persons by means of my left arm. But very fearful in that case, proximity of the steel, the result of the slightest struggle, how deadly. Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of the torture had not foreseen and provided for its possibility? Was it probable that the bandage across my bosom in the track of the pendulum? Dreading to find my fate, and as it seemed in last hope frustrated, I so far elevated my hand as to obtain a distinct view of my breast. Sir Kringle enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save in the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped my head back in its original position, when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the informed half of an idea of deliverance which I had previously alluded, and for which moiety only floated indeterminately through my brain when I raised my food to my burning lips. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely defined, but still entire. I proceeded at once, with the nervous energy of despair, to attempt its execution. For many hours the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their eyes glaring upon me as if they waited but for motionlessness on my part to make me their prey. To what food, I thought. Had they been accustomed in the well? They had devoured in spite of all efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of the dish. I had fallen into the habitual seesaw or wave of the hand about the platter, and at length the unconscious uniformity of the movement deprived it of effort. In their ferocity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp fangs in my fingers. With the particles of the oily and spicy viand, I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach it, then raised my hand from the floor. I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the cessation of movement. They shrieked alarmingly back. Many sought the well, but this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their ferocity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the circingle. This seemed to signal for a general rush. I had not counted in vain their ferocity. Observing that I remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the circingle. This seemed the signal for the general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leaped in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding the strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed, they swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. Disgust, for which the world has no name, swelled my bosom and chilled, with a heavy calmness, my heart. Yet 1 minute and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it was already severed. With a more than human resolution, I lay still. Nor had I erred in my calculations, nor had I endured in vain. I at length felt that I was free. The circingle hung in ribbons from my body, but the stroke of the pendulum already pressed upon my bosom. It had divided the serge of the robe,
It had cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung, and a sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve. But the moment of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away with a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrieking, and slow. I slid from the embrace of the bandage and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free, and in the grasp of the Inquisition, I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison, when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I beheld it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was a lesson which I took desperately at heart. My every moment was undoubtedly watched. Free, I had but escaped death in one form of agony, to be delivered unto worse than death in some other. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change at first I could not appreciate distinctly. It was obvious, had taken place in the apartment. For many minutes of a dreamy and trembling abstraction, I busied myself in vain, unconnected conjuncture. During this period I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illuminated the cell. It proceeded from the fissure, about half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison at the base of the walls, which thus appeared and were completely separated from the floor. I endeavored, but of course in vain, to look through the aperture. As I rose from the attempt, the mystery of the alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of the figure upon the walls were sufficiently distant, yet the colors seemed blurred and indefinite. These colors had now assumed, and were momentarily assuming, a startling and most intense brilliancy. They gave to the spectral and fiendish portraitures an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than mine. Demon eyes of a wild and ghastly vivacity glared upon me in 1,000 directions, where none had been visible before, and gleamed with a lurid lust of fire that I could not force my imagination to regard as unreal. Unreal! Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted. I grasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting, oh, most demonic of man. I panted. I grasped for breath. There could be no doubt but to the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting, oh, most demonic of men. I shrank from the glowing metal at the center of the cell, amid the thought of fiery destruction that impeded. The idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my strained vision below. The glare from the enkindled roof illuminated inmost recession. The glare from the enkindled roof illuminated its inmost recession. Yet for a wild moment did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length it wrestled its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for the voice to speak! Oh, the horror! Oh, any horror but this! With a shriek I rushed from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased, and once again I looked up, shuddering as with a fit of the ague. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the change was obviously in the form. As before, it was in vain that I at first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place, but not long was I left in doubt. The inquisitional vengeance had been hurried by my two-folded escape, and there was to be no more dallying with the king of terrors. The room had been square. I saw the two of his iron angles were now acute, two consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant the apartment had shifted its form into that of a lozenge. But the altercation stopped. Not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit. Fool! Might I have not known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow, or even that? Could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge. Or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge, with a rapidity that left me no time to contemplate. Its center, and of course its great width, came just over the yawning gulf. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressured me relentlessly onward. At length, for my seared and withered body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered up to the brink. I averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was the loudest blast of many trumpets. There was the harsh gratings as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fainting into the abyss. It was that of General LaSalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. Here an unholy mob of torturers, with insatiable thirst for innocent blood, once fed their long frenzy. Now our homeland is safe, the funeral cave destroyed, and life and health appear where dreadful death once was.
Miriam by Truman Capote.
For several years, Miss H.T. Miller lived alone in a pleasant apartment, 2 rooms with a kitchenette, and a remodeled brownstone near East River. She was a widow. Mr. H.T. Miller had left a reasonable amount of insurance. Her interests were narrow. She had no friends to speak of, and she rarely journeyed further than the corner grocery. The other people in the house never seemed to notice her. Her clothes were matter of fact, her hair iron gray, clipped and casually waved. She did not use cosmetics. Her features were plain and inconspicuous, and on her last birthday she was 61. Her activities were seldom spontaneous. She kept the 2 rooms immaculate, smoked an occasional cigarette, prepared her own meal, and tended a canary. And then she met Miriam. It was snowing that night. Miss Miller had finished drying the supper dishes. It was thumbing through an afternoon paper when she saw an advertisement of a picture playing at a neighborhood theater. The title sounded good, so she struggled into her beaver coat, laced up her galoshes, and left the apartment, leaving one light burning in the foyer. She found nothing more disturbing than a sensation of darkness. The snow was fine, falling gently, not yet making an impression on the pavement. The wind from the river cut only at street crossings. Miss Miller hurried, her head bowed, oblivious as a mole burrowing a blind path. She stopped at a drugstore and bought a package of peppermints. A long line stretched in front of the box office. She took her place at the end. There would be a tired voice groaned, a short wait for all seats. Miss Miller rummaged in her leather handbag till she collected exactly the correct change for admission. The line seemed to be taking its own time, and, looking around for some distinctions, she suddenly became conscientious of a little girl standing under the edge of the marquee. Her hair was the longest and strangest Miss Miller had ever seen, absolutely silver white like an albino's. It flowed waist-length in smooth, loose lines. She was thin and fragilely constructed. There was a simple, special elegance in the way she stood, with her thumbs in the pockets of a tailored plum velvet coat. Miss Miller felt oddly excited, and when the little girl glanced toward her, she smiled warmly. The little girl walked over and said, "Would you care to do me a favor?" "I'll be glad to do it if I can," said Miss Miller. "Oh, it's easy. I merely want you to buy a ticket for me. They won't let me in otherwise. Here, I have the money." And gracefully she handed Miss Miller 2 dimes and a nickel. They went over to the theater together. The usherette directed them to a lounge. In 20 minutes, the picture would be over. I feel just like a genuine criminal, said Miss Miller gaily, as she sat down. I mean, that sort of thing's against the law, isn't it? I do hope I haven't done the wrong thing. Your mother knows where you are, dear. I mean, she does, doesn't she? The little girl said nothing. She unbuttoned her coat and folded it across her lap. Her dress underneath was prim and dark blue. A golden chain dangled about her neck, and her fingers, sensitive and musically alike, toyed with it. Examining her more attentively, Miss Miller decided that truly distinctive feature was not her hair, but her eyes. They were hazel, steady, lacking any childhood quality whatsoever, because of their size, seemed to consume her small face. Miss Miller offered a peppermint. What's your name, dear? Miriam, she said, as though in some way it were information already familiar. Why, isn't that funny? My name's Miriam, too. And it's not a terribly common name, either. Now, don't tell me your last name's Miller. Just Miriam. But isn't that funny? Moderately, said Miriam, and rolled a peppermint on her tongue. Miss Miller flushed and shifted uncomfortably. You have such a large vocabulary for such a young girl. Do I? Well, yes, said Miss Miller, hastily changing the topic to, do you like the movies? I really wouldn't know, said Miriam. I've never been before. Women began filling the lounge. The rumble of newsreel bombs exploded in the distance. Miss Miller rose, tucking her purse under her arm. I guess I'll be running now, if I want to get a good seat, she said. It was nice to have met you. Miriam nodded ever so slightly. It snowed all week. Wheels and footsteps moved soundlessly on the street, as if the business of living continued secretly behind a pale but impenetrable curtain. In the falling quiet there was no sky or earth, only snow lifted in the wind, frosting the window glass, chilling the rooms, deadening and hushing the city. At all hours it was necessary to keep a lamp lighted, and Miss Miller lost track of the days. Friday was no different from Saturday, and on Sunday she went to the grocery store, closed of course. That evening she scrambled eggs and fixed a bowl of tomato soup. Then, after putting on a flannel robe and cold creaming her face, she propped herself up in bed with a water bottle under her feet. She was reading the Times when the doorbell rang. At first she thought it must be a mistake, and whoever it was would go away. But it rang and settled to a persistent buzz. She looked at her clock a little after 11. It did not seem possible. She was always asleep by 10. Climbing out of bed, she trotted barefoot across the living room. I'm coming, please be patient. The latch was caught. She turned it this way and that, and the bell never stopped for an instant. Stop it, she cried. The bolt gave way, and she opened the door an inch. What in heaven's name? Hello, said Miriam. Oh, why, hello, said Miss Miller, stepping hesitantly in the hall. You're that little girl. I thought you'll never answer, but I kept my finger on the button. I knew you were home. Aren't you glad to see me? Miss Miller did not know what to say. Miriam, she saw, wore the same plum velvet coat, and now she had also a beret to match. Her white hair was braided in 2 shining plaits and looped at the ends with enormous white ribbons. Since I've waited so long, you could have at least let me in, she said. It's awfully late. Miriam regarded her blankly. What difference does it make? Let me in. It's cold out here. I have on a silk dress. Then, with a gentle gesture, she urged Miss Miller aside and passed into the apartment. She dropped her coat and beret on a chair. She was indeed wearing a silk dress, white silk in February. The skirt was beautifully pleated, and the sleeves long. It had a faint rustle as she strode about the room. I like your place, she said. I like the rug. Blue's my favorite color. She touched a paper rose in a vase on the coffee table. Imitation, she commented wanly. How sad. Aren't imitations sad? She seated herself on the sofa, daintily spreading her skirt. What do you want? Miss Miller asked. Sit down, said Miriam. It makes me nervous to see people stand. Miss Miller sank to a hassock. What do you want? she repeated. You know, I don't think you're glad I came. For a second, Miss Miller was without an answer. Her hand motioned vaguely. Miriam giggled and pressed back on the amount of chintz pillows. Miss Miller noticed that the girl was less pale than she remembered. Her cheeks were flushed. How do you know where I lived? Miriam frowned. That's no question at all. What's your name? What's mine? But I'm not listed in the phone book. Oh, let's talk about something else. Miss Miller said, your mother must be insane to let a child like you wander around at all hours of the night, and in such ridiculous clothes. She must be out of her mind. Miriam got up and moved to a corner where a covered birdcage hung from the ceiling chain. She peeked under the cover. It's a canary, she said. Would you mind if I woke him? I like to hear him sing. Leave Tommy alone, Miss Miller said anxiously. Don't you dare wake him. Certainly, said Miriam. But I don't see why I can't hear him sing. And then, have you anything to eat? I'm starving. Even milk and jam sandwich would be fine. Look, said Miss Miller, arising from her hassock. Look, if I make you some nice sandwiches, will you be a good child and run along home? It's past midnight, I'm sure. It's snowing, reproached Miriam, and cold and dark. Well, you shouldn't have come here to begin with, said Miss Miller, struggling to control her voice. I can't help the weather. If you want anything to eat, you'll have to promise to leave. Miriam brushed a braid against her cheek. Her eyes were thoughtful, as if weighing the proposition. She turned toward the birdcage. Very well, she said. I promise. How old is she? 10? 11? Miss Miller in the kitchen unsealed a jar of strawberry preserves and cut 4 slices of bread. She poured a glass of milk and paused to light a cigarette. And why has she come? Her hand shook as she held the match, fascinated till it burned her finger. The canary was singing as he did in the morning and at no other time. Miriam, she called. Miriam, I told you not to disturb Tommy. There was no answer. She called again. All she heard was the canary. She inhaled the cigarette and discovered she had lighted the cork tip end, and oh really, she mustn't lose her temper. She carried the food in on a tray and set it on the coffee table. She saw first that the birdcage still wore its night cover, and Tommy was singing. It gave her a queer sensation, and no one was in the room. Miss Miller went through the alcove leading to her bedroom. At the door, she caught her breath. What are you doing? She asked. Miriam glanced up, and in her eyes was a look that was not ordinary. She was standing by the bureau, a jewelry case open before her. For a minute she studied Miss Miller, forcing their eyes to meet, and she smiled. There's nothing good here, she said, but I like this. Her hand held a cameo brooch. It's charming. Suppose. Perhaps you should put it back, said Miss Miller, feeling suddenly the need of some support. She leaned against the door frame. Her head was unbearably heavy. A pressure weighted the rhythm of her heartbeat. The light seemed to flutter defectively. Please, child, a gift from my husband. It's beautiful, and I want it, said Miriam. Give it to me. As she stood, striving to shape a sentence which would somehow save the brooch, it came to Miss Miller. There was no one to whom she might turn. She was alone, a fact that had not been among her thoughts for a long time. Its sheer emphasis was stunning. But here in her own room, in the hushed show city, were evidence she could not ignore, or, she knew with startling clarity, resist. Miriam ate ravenously, and when the sandwich and milk were gone, her fingers made cobweb movements over the plates, gathering crumbs. The cameo gleamed on her blouse, the blonde profile like a trick reflection on its wearer. This was very nice, she sighed, though now an almond cake or a cherry would be great. Sweets are lovely, don't you think? Miss Miller was perched precautiously on the hassock, smoking a cigarette. Her hairnet had slipped lopsided, and loose strands strangled down her face. Her eyes were stupidly concentrated on nothing. Her cheeks were mottled in red patches, as though a fierce slap had left permanent marks. Is there a candy? A cake? Miss Miller tapped ash onto the rug. Her head swayed slightly as she tried to focus her eyes. You promised to leave if I made you a sandwich, she said. Dear me, did I? It was a promise, and I'm tired. I don't feel well at all. Mustn't fret, said Miriam. I'm only teasing. She picked up her coat, slung it over her arm, and arranged her beret in front of a mirror. Presently she bent close to Miss Miller and whispered, Kiss me good night. Please, I rather not, said Miss Miller. Miriam lifted a shoulder, arched her eyebrow. As you like, she said, and went directly to the coffee table, seized the vase containing the paper rose, carried it to where the hard surface of the floor lay bare, and hurled it downward. Glass sprang in all directions, and she stamped her foot on the bouquet. Then slowly she walked to the door, but before closing it, she looked back at Miss Miller with a sly, innocent curiosity. Miss Miller spent the next day in bed, raising once to feed the canary and drink a cup of tea. She took her temperature and had none, yet her dreams were feverishly agitated. Their balanced mood lingered, even as she lay staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. One dream threaded through the others like an elusive, mysterious theme in a complicated symphony, and the scenes it depicted were sharply outlined, as though sketched by the hand of a gifted intensity. A small girl, wearing a bridal gown and a wreath of leaves, led a gray procession down a mountain path. Among them there was unusual silence till a woman at the rear asked, "Where is she taking us?" "No one knows," said the old man, marching in front. "But isn't she pretty?" volunteered a third. "Isn't she like a frosted flower, so shining and white?" Tuesday morning she woke up feeling better. Harsh lights of sunlight slanting through the Venetian blinds shed a disrupting light on her unwholesome fancies. She opened the window to discover a thawed, mild as spring day. A sweep of clean new clouds crumpled against the vastly blue, out-of-season sky, and across the low lines of rooftops she could see the river and smoke curving from tugboat stacks in a warm wind. A great silver truck plowed the snow-banked streets, its machine sound humming on the air. After straightening the apartment, she went to the grocer's, cashed a check, and continued to Schraff's, where she ate breakfast and chatted happily with the waitress. Oh, it was a wonderful day, more like a holiday, and yet it would be foolish to go home. She boarded a Lexington Avenue bus and rode to 86th Street. It was here that she decided to do a little shopping. She had no idea what she wanted or needed. She idled along, intent only upon the passerby, brisk and preoccupied, who gave her a disturbing sense of separateness. It was while waiting at the corner of 3rd Avenue that she saw the man, an old man, bow-legged and stooped under an armload of bulging packages. He wore a shabby brown coat and a checkered cap. Suddenly she realized they were exchanging a smile. There was nothing friendly about this smile. It was merely 2 cold flickers of recognition, but she was certain she had never seen him before. He was standing next to an L pillar, and as she crossed the street he turned, followed. He kept quite close. From the corner of her eyes she watched his reflection wavering on shop windows. Then in the middle of the block she stopped and faced him. He stopped also and cocked his head, grinning. But what could she say? Do, here in the middle of broad daylight on 86th Street. It was useless. Despising her own helplessness, she quickened her steps. Now 2nd Street is a dismal street, made from scraps and ends, part cobblestone, part asphalt, part cement, and its atmosphere of desertion is permanent. Miss Miller walked 5 blocks without meeting anyone, and all the while the steady crunch of his footfalls and the snow stayed nearby. And when she came to the florist shop, the sound was still with her. She hurried inside and watched through the glass window as the old man passed. He kept his eyes straight ahead and did not slow his pace, but he did one strange, telling thing. He tipped his cap. 6 white ones, did you say? Asked the florist. Yes, she told him. White roses. From there she went to a glassware store and selected a vase, presumably a replacement for the one Miriam had broken, though the price was intolerable and the vase itself she thought grotesquely vulgar. But a series of uncontrolled purchases had begun, as if by prearranged plan, a plan which she had not the least knowledge or control. She bought a bag of glazed cherries, and at a place called Knickerbocker Bakery, she paid 40 cents for 6 almond cakes. Within the last hour the weather had turned cold again. Like blurred lenses, winter clouds cast a shadow over the sun, and the skeleton of an early dusk colored the sky. A damp mist mixed with the wind, and the voices of a few children who romped high on the mountains of gutter snow seemed lonely and cheerless. Soon the first flake fell, and Miss Miller reached the brownstone house. Snow was falling in a swift screen, and foot tracks vanished as they were printed. The white roses were arranged decoratively in the vase. The glazed cherries shone on a ceramic plate. The almond cakes, dusted with sugar, awaited a hand. The canary fluttered on its swing and picked at a bar of seed. At precisely 5 o'clock the door rang. Miss Miller knew who it was. The hem of her house coat trailed as she crossed the floor. "Is that you?" she called. "Naturally," said Miriam. The word resounded shrill from the hall. "Open this door." "Go away," said Miss Miller. "Please hurry. I have a heavy package." "Go away," said Miss Miller. She returned to the living room, lighted the cigarette, sat down, and calmly listened to the buzzer. On and on and on. "You might as well leave. I have no intentions of letting you in." Shortly the bell stopped, for possibly 10 minutes. Miss Miller did not move. Then, hearing no sound, she concluded Miriam had gone. She tiptoed to the door and opened it a sliver. Miriam was half reclining atop a cardboard box with a beautiful French doll cradled in her arms. "Really? I never thought you were coming," she said peevishly. "Here, help me get this in. It's awfully heavy." It was no spell-like compulsion that Miss Miller felt, but rather a curious passivity. She brought in the box. Miriam the doll. Miriam curled up on the sofa, not troubling to remove her coat or beret, and watched disinterestedly as Miss Miller dropped the box and stood trembling, trying to catch her breath. "Thank you," she said. In the daylight she looked pinched and drawn, her hair less luminous. The French doll she was loving wore an exquisite powdered wig, and its idiot's glass eyes sought solace in Miriam's. "I have a surprise," she continued. "Look into my box." Kneeling, Miss Miller parted the flaps and lifted out another doll. Then a blue dress which she recalled as the one Miriam had worn that first night at the theater, and of the reminder she had said, "It's old clothes. Why?" "Because I've come to live with you," said Miriam, twisting a cherry stem. "Wasn't it nice of you to buy me cherries?" "But you can't! For God's sakes, go away! Go away and leave me alone!" "And the roses and the almond cakes are really wonderfully generous. You know those cherries are delicious. The last place I lived was with an old man. He was terribly poor, and he never had good things to eat. But I think I'll be happy here." She paused to snuggle her doll closer. "Now if you'll just show me where to put my things." Miss Miller's face dissolved into a mask of ugly red lines. She began to cry. It was an unnatural, tearless sort of weeping, as though, not having wept for a long time, she had forgotten how. Carefully she edged backward till she touched the door. She fumbled through the hall and down the stairs to a landing below. She pounded frantically on the door of the first apartment she came to. A short, red-headed man answered, and she pushed past him. "Say, what the hell is this?" he said. "Anything wrong, lover?" asked a young woman who appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands, and it was her that Miss Miller turned. "Listen," she cried. "I'm ashamed to be behaving this way, but, well, I'm Miss H.T. Miller, and I live upstairs." She pressed her hands over her face. "It sounds so absurd." The woman guided her to a chair, while the man excitedly rattled pocket change. "Yeah? I live upstairs, and there's this little girl visiting me, and I suppose I'm afraid of her. She won't leave me alone, and I can't make her, and she's going to do something terrible. She's already stolen my cameo, and she's about to do something worse, more terrible." The man asked, "Is she a relative, huh?" Miss Miller shook her head. "I don't know who she is. Her name's Miriam, and I don't know for certain who she is." "You gotta calm down, honey," said the woman, stroking Miss Miller's arm. "Harry here will tend to this child. Go on, love." And Miss Miller said, "The door's open, two-way." And the man left, and the woman brought a towel and bathed Miss Miller's face. "You're very kind," Miss Miller said. "I'm sorry to act like such a fool. Only this wicked child." "Sure, honey," consoled the woman. "Now you better take it easy." Miss Miller rested her head in the crook of her arm. She was quiet enough to sleep. The woman turned a radio dial. A piano and a husky voice filled the silence, and the woman tapping her foot kept excellent time. "Maybe we ought to go up too," she said. "I don't want to see her again. I don't want to be anywhere near her." "Oh, uh-huh. But what you should have done, you should have called a cop." Presently they heard the man on the stairs. He strode in the room, frowning and scratching his head on his neck. "Nobody there," he said, honestly embarrassed. "She must have beat it." "Harry, you're a jerk," announced the woman. "We've been sitting here the whole time, and you would have seen—" She stopped abruptly. The man's face glance was sharp. "I looked all over," he said. "And there ain't nobody there. Nobody. Understand?" "Tell me," said Miss Miller, rising. "Tell me, did you see a large box or a doll?" "No, ma'am, I didn't." And the woman, as if delivering a verdict, said, "Well, for crying out loud!" Miss Miller entered her apartment softly. She walked to the center of the room and stood quite still. No, in a sense it had not changed. The roses, the cakes, and the cherries were in place, but it was an empty room. Emptier than if the furnishings and familiars were not present, lifeless and petrified as a funeral parlor. The sofa loomed before her with a new strangeness. Its vacancy had a meaning that would have been less penetrating and terrible had Miriam been curled on it. She gazed fixedly at the space where she remembered setting the box, and for a moment the hassock spun desperately. And she had looked through that window. Surely the river was real. Surely the snow was falling. But then one cannot be certain witness to anything. Miriam, so vividly there, and yet, where was she? Where? Where? As though moving in a dream, she sank to the chair. The room was losing shape. It was dark and getting darker, and there was nothing to be done about it. She could not lift her hand to light the lamp. Suddenly, closing her eyes, she felt an upward surge like a diver emerging from some deeper, greener depth. In times of terror or immense distress, there are moments when the mind waits as though for a revelation, while a skein of calm is woven over thought. It's like a sleep or supernatural trance, and during this lull one is aware of a force of quiet reasoning. Well, what if she had never really known a girl named Miriam? That she had been foolishly frightened on the streets? In the end, like everything else, it was of no importance. For the only thing she had lost to Miriam was her identity. For now she knew she had found again the person who lived in this room, who cooked her own meals, who owned a canary, who was something she could trust and believe in, Miss H.T. Miller. Listening in contentment, she became aware of a double sound, a bureau drawer opening and closing. She seemed to hear it long after completion, opening and closing. And gradually the harshness by the murmur of a silk dress, and this, delicately faint, was moving nearer and swelling in its intensity till the walls trembled with the vibration and the room was caving under a wave of whispers. Miss Miller stiffened and opened her eyes to a dull, direct stare. "Hello," said Miriam.